Okay, well, the title of the talk is Fanny Austen Challenges and Achievements in Making a Family Home on Board HMS Namur. Fanny Austen was a young woman who had a unique connection to the Chatham Dockyard. She was never a flag maker in the color and sail loft or employed in the spinning rooms, as other 19th century women in his exhibition were. Fanny counts as one of the hidden heroines because of her life on HMS Namur. The Namur was one of the most famous ships built at the Chatham Dockyard. When her husband, Captain Charles Austen, was in her command from late 1811 to 14, the capable Fanny undertook the unusual task of making a family home for him and their young daughters on board. And by young daughters, I mean very young children. Little Cassie was 3, and Harriet was 2, and then baby Fan would arrive a year later. So you need to have sort of the mental picture of who we're talking about. Then he wrote letters from the Namur. These are candid and articulate letters. They're written to family members, and they reveal her opinions and sentiments about the challenges she faced. She tells us what it was like to be a naval wife and mother living at sea during the later years of the Napoleonic Wars. In fact, she provides a strikingly realistic picture of naval family life on board, as seen from a woman's perspective. So I'd like to take you on board to share with you how Fanny coped with this exceptional situation. When Charles was commissioned into the Namur, Fanny must have wondered about the size of the ship and what the vessel's current naval duties were. Launched at Chatham in 1756, the Namur had seen action in 9 important sea battles. Originally a 3-decker ship of 90 guns, in 1804 she was reduced to a 2-decker with 74 guns. She rode at anchor at the Great Nore. The Great Nore refers to an area located offshore 3 miles northeast from Sheerness, Kent. She was in use as a receiving ship for sailors, both volunteers and pressed men, waiting to be assigned to warships needing crews. She also acted as a guard ship. This meant she was the first line of defense against any enemy vessels that might attempt an attack on the Sheerness and Chatham naval yards, or, more crucially, an advance upon London further up the Thames. So there was an element of risk where Fanny was about to be located. So they're aboard now, and once aboard, quite frankly, Fanny found that household management was going to test her ingenuity and her patience. Her initial priority for her was to reconfigure the captain's quarters. Now, they were in the stern of the ship. This would be the back half of the quarterdeck and under the poop deck. And so what Charles would ordinarily be allotted was now going to serve, a richer function. It was going to be where they would all live, all 4 of them. So Fanny wanted to decide, what do I do to best suit my family's needs and comforts? Charles's day cabin was nice. It had large glass windows that looked out on the anchorage. There would be access to an exterior gallery, but this was a room that would be needed sometimes for his official business, and so it was the adjacent areas that became Fanny's private preserve. Now, most likely, there would have been existing walls which marked out a stateroom or sleeping cabin on one side and another cabin on the other. And so Fanny could complete the division of the remaining area by directing the placement of movable wooden panels. Fortunately, the family quarters enjoyed some measure of quiet and seclusion. They were only accessible from the quarterdeck, and that was the exclusive domain of the officers. And probably Fanny found this comforting. An armed Marine would stand on guard at the entrance to the captain's quarters all the time. This would be a unique feature of living on board. So what did Fanny think she'd accomplished? I'd like to read you passages from Fanny's letters so you can hear her voice. Initially, she was enthusiastic about the adaptations made to make a family living space. She wrote to her brother-in-law, James, in Bermuda in January 1812. Mama and Palmer's her nephew, have been staying with us, and we mean to keep them as long as the holidays will permit. They're very much pleased with our habitation, which now that we've got things to rights, we find extremely comfortable. During a visit by her father several months later, Fanny noted, Papa's very much pleased with our accommodations. He enjoys sleeping in a cot Extremely. Now, it strikes me this was quite a feat for Fanny's aging father because he's sleeping on a small canvas bed. It's only 3 feet wide, and it is swinging from the ceiling. Other members of the Austen family expressed an opinion. Charles's sister, Cassandra Austen, observed to a cousin that Fanny and their children are actually living with Charles on board. We doubted whether such a scheme would prove practical during the winter, but they found their residency very tolerably comfortable, and it's so much the cheapest home that she could have that they're very right to put up with a little inconveniences. 3 months later, Cassandra visited the Namur to see for herself what she called in letters Fanny and Charles's aquatic abode. Fanny was initially pleased that she'd got things to rights with her habitation, that she created an establishment where they could live and sleep in relative comfort. Unfortunately, problems arose which interfered with the smooth running of her household. Fanny required at least one female servant to help with child care, to perform basic domestic tasks, and by time to serve as her lady's maid. Yet competent servants willing to live and work at sea proved difficult to find and even harder to retain. As Fanny wrote, "I'm much teased in my domestic concerns and am at this moment without a nurse. Though I had a very nice woman in that capacity, some lady has most unhandsomely enticed her away from me by holding out advantages which I could not." As a result of her servant problems, Fanny took on more domestic tasks herself than would ordinarily be expected by a gentlewoman. It didn't help that the weather was changeable and sometimes exceptionally rough. Seasickness was a problem for which Fanny had no easy remedy. Her eldest girl, Cassie, was particularly vulnerable, and Fanny hated to see her grow exceedingly thin and look poorly. Nor did Fanny want her children to suffer on board in frigid weather when a damp chill penetrated and persisted. From 1813 onward, Fanny regularly sent her daughters to spend time on shore with her aunts, and her aunts were Jane, the novelist, and Cassandra Austen, who lived at Chatham Cottage in Hampshire, or to Fanny's sister Harriet Palmer in London. But this arrangement distressed her. She missed her daughters terribly in their absence, and such an arrangement made it impossible to maintain the family intimacy which Fanny so greatly valued. Furthermore, her efforts to create a pleasing and peaceful atmosphere within their home space was sometimes frustrated by the darker side of naval life. She was living in a world where misdemeanors were punished swiftly and brutally. The Royal Navy required that instances of mutinous language and conduct, disobedience of orders, theft, interpersonal violence, drunkenness, or riotous behavior must be punished by public flogging. During Fanny's tenure on board, there were 5 occasions of the cruel sort of punishment known as flogging round the fleet. Now, perhaps Charles was able to warn Fanny in advance when a flogging was about to occur, perhaps even arrange for her to be on shore in nearby Sheerness. Yet inevitably there must have been times where there was no ready escape from the distress cries of the punished. We don't know how Fanny managed to cope with the cruelty of flogging, with the sound of suffering, with the ominous pulsating of the drums which accompanied the lashings, all terribly disturbing noises for her and her children. Other features of Fanny's situation came to bother her over time. She was lonely in her isolation from genteel female company, and she felt confined by the limited area of the ship's quarterdeck where she could move freely. And she probably just developed cabin fever too, which would go with the isolation. Now, and I wrote this for you. I thought, well, you must think that this was hideous and she hated every minute of it. I don't think that's the fair assessment because even though it may sound from what I've said that sometimes it was very difficult, and there were situations which tried her patience and triggered her disappointment, there were happy and more satisfying occasions. So I'd like to share those with you. Fanny helped to create an atmosphere of supportive friendliness for midshipmen and other young trainee officers under Charles's tutelage. As these young men received some of their instruction in the captain's cabin, they'd be close with where Fanny was, and they must also benefit from her feminine attention. And they in turn gave her something. They gave her a sense of community within the Navy of the quarterdeck, and I think she found that satisfying, that she was doing her bit as well. Fanny also appreciated Charles' initiatives to bring civilizing influence to rough and rigorous shipboard life. There was a band of musicians on board, although Fanny's father, while visiting the Namur, remarked on the indifferent talent of the clarinet player. Nonetheless, it was cheering to have a source of music, even if it fell far short of professional standards. Charles encouraged his sailors to present theatrical entertainments for the edification of the officers and men. This pleased Fanny, although on one occasion she notes, "We were all disappointed, for the theater was not finished, and consequently they were obliged to postpone acting until next Monday." Best of all, though, for Fanny was the joy of uninterrupted togetherness of her family. Fanny and the little girls had the pleasure of Charles's regular company. He was at hand to help with the children's education, to play with them at bedtime, and to celebrate the milestones of their development, such as when the baby of the family, little Fanny, was born early December 1812, showed great determination to walk on her own. Fanny and Charles could also share in their children's newfound pleasures, such as Cassie's delight when she mastered the technique of leaving the ship by the boatswain's chair, which swung her out from the Namur's main deck and swooped her down to a waiting tender that would take her on shore. So why is Fanny to be seen as a heroine? I think there are 3 to 4 reasons here. She was brave to take on the project of creating a home for a beloved family on a working naval ship during wartime. She was courageous to take the chance of living with small children on a coastal guard ship, exposed to the possibility of attack from the enemy's navy across the North Sea. Fanny was also heroic in the way she carried out her life, distinct from the expected behavior of naval wives who made homes on land where shops, services, and supplies were readily accessible, where social routines were predictable and comforts dependably available. Fanny, finally, had the courage to commit to a lifestyle of immediate support for Charles, to be his affectionate companion, and to encourage him during the hazards and uncertainties of his naval career, regardless of the risk to herself. She was his heroine as well as ours. And as you may know from the notice to the meeting, we're together today, what would have been the 242nd anniversary of Charles Austen's birthday. And it seems very fitting that we're doing what we're doing. So there's my piece. Okay, I think we're over to Allie, are we?
Yeah, no, that's really lovely. Thank you very much, Sheila. I still think it's amazing that having these women and children aboard, and domestic servants. I did not realise I got domestic servants, but I'm going to kick off the questions, if you don't mind, and ask you, so what was life like kind of day to day looking after the children, and where did they get their food? Could you tell us a bit more about that?
Sure, right. I have notes here. My husband said, you know everything, Sheila, to know about this topic, so just cut it, just talk. I'm going to talk. Okay. So the question was, what was day-to-day like? I've mentioned they were very young children. Well, I think because they were young children, especially when the baby came on board, she did need, like a nursemaid, to help with the management of them. They are on a vessel. There's only confined quarters which they can circulate through, and I'm thinking of the winter. Fanny went on board to make the home in January of 1812. It was cold at sea. Ordinarily, the Admiralty would provide a stove for the captain's cabin. And I'm just hoping that they would be a little more generous in this case and provide another one, so that, in the exclusive family space, that they would not be, that things would be a little more comfortable. In Fanny's time, for her class and a position, the ideal of domesticity was very crucial. The woman's role would be to make a home that provided comfort, that provided intimacy. And so she was trying hard to do that, but it also entailed, you've asked about the food, that she would make sure there was a well-stocked larder, so as to speak. And from the evidence of her letters and her diary, it looks as though she tried very hard to do that. From what I can see, she would not have access to her own share of the standard naval rations. This would be, some meat, cereal, pork, beef, butter, cheese, et cetera, though I expect Charles would share what he had with her. though she was able to periodically get on shore to either Sheerness or Southend, where she could get fresh supplies. She seemed to have a good eye for a bargain if she could get quantities of something, which would be what they would need. Her pocketbook describes her, buying fruit, so to speak. So that's a healthy thing. I think it was a 24/7 job. Really, maybe not quite that, but it must have felt like it sometime. I was amused to read because I was thinking how Fanny made it look better, so that it just was a little more attractive as a living space. And there was somebody hired to paint aboard the vessel in the summer. So Fanny might have been able to corral him to just do something in the captain's quarters. And apparently the Navy board that provided the paint had a rule that you were never to use lilac, purple, dead white, or bright green on a vessel. Why they were so antsy about those colors, I don't know. I decided Fanny probably didn't want any of those colors anyway. So that gives you a bit of a profile. Okay.
Thank you very much. So please either raise your hand or put your questions into the chat box. We've had one from Jill here, who's asked, what did the Navy think of women on the ship during wartime?
Yes, that's a very good question. I mean, people have said to me, well, why would Fanny be allowed? I think there were a number of reasons. You have to think of where she was located. They were at sea, 3 miles offshore. There was no plan, unless there was some kind of an emergency, like an enemy attack, for them to go into action. And so I think the thinking was, though I think she still had taken on a measure of risk. She was close enough to shore that if there was some kind of really difficult situation, that she and the children could leave the vessel. They would have had to have the permission of Charles Commander-in-Chief at the Namur, that he would approve that she could be living on the flagship with the family. It may have helped that he was Admiral Sir Thomas Williams. He had been married to a well-loved first cousin of Jane and Cassandra and Charles Austen. She had died an early death, unfortunately, and he had another wife. But I think he would have been favorably disposed, to help the family out and let them do what they clearly wished to do. They wanted to be together.
Thank you. And we have a fun question next. So Jane Austen mentions finding fleas in her bed after little Cassie had stayed at Chatham. Would they have come from the Namur?
Oh, I see. Well, I think that's a Jane Austen joke. It's not one of these things to be taken literally. Contextually, this relates to a period where Cassie Austen, Fanny's eldest daughter, had spending quite a lot of time with her aunts at Chatham. She'd obviously she was going to be coming into the bed that Jane had been sleeping in. Well, Jane was off in London, and so this is just it's quite nice of Jane, I think, to send a special message to her niece, saying, just tell her, if when she comes down, if she brings fleas in, then this isn't good. Yeah. I think on this occasion, when Cassie was going to be coming to Chatham to be with those aunts, she would have been coming from another aunt, Harriet, in London, who was very scrupulous in terms of the level of care the children would have. I don't think any fleas would get past Harriet. But it's a good question, because it points out however careful Fanny might have been to keep things, scrupulously clean and free of bugs. She's at sea ordinarily, and the kids are with her when they can be. It's damp, right? It could be flea territory. So that's my informed and uninformed view on that.
Thank you. And the next question from Marion here is, what was the size of the quarterdeck available to Fanny? Did you say there was a armed sailor outside their quarters?
Yes, there was a Marine outside the quarters. I did look up the dimensions of the Namur. Now, this doesn't quite tell you. The quarterdeck is about halfway along the vessel, which is 174 feet long. All right, but it's within that quarterdeck that you have the captain's cabin. When I started my research on living on the Namur, I did get in touch with the Caird Library at the National Maritime Museum in Greenwich and said, do you have any plans of the layout of the Namur as of the time that the Austens would be on board? And they said, no, they were sorry. They knew a bit about how she'd been cut down from 94 to 74 guns, but they had no idea about the layout inside. So I didn't have access to answer that question. So think of the quarterdeck being half the vessel. It's only a smaller portion within the quarterdeck area that is the captain's. But I do know how wide it was. The vessel was 48 feet wide. So whatever depth she had, now, it's very difficult to determine. It was 48 feet wide. It was still small. It was small.
Thank you. Are there any other questions from the floor? I know Lynette had one.
Someone wants to know if there were other captains' wives staying on board. We're thinking about this particular phase when Fanny is on board. I have read in passing references of women who were living on board. I can't give you chapter and verse on who they were, what vessel they were on, until I looked that up. I'm sure you could be sympathetic in that I have this huge compendium of small details, either in my files, but they're not always right on my mind. Yes, it did sometimes happen. It wasn't particularly encouraged, though they do have, they have details about the Battle of Trafalgar and whether there were any women on the Victory. And there apparently were a number of vessels of women on the Victory, and there's certainly some objections that they seem to be precluded from being recognized. That anybody who fought in any capacity or been on the Victory got some kind of medal of recognition, and the women were excluded. Now, probably a more common situation when women were on board is when a captain is moving within a station. So some of Fanny's quotes living on board was when she is with Charles and she's shuttling between Bermuda and Halifax. Now, so that is a variable length of time, because for Fanny as a naval wife, she did live with him as a naval wife, both on shore in Bermuda and on shore in Halifax, and then at sea. Right? And then she also crosses the North Atlantic with him, which is a number of weeks. And then this Namur thing is for the better part of 2 years, right? So she had an unusual trajectory, really. And of course, what is even more unusual is she wrote about it. So you know what it was like. It's one thing to be told, Captain X had his wife aboard at one point, but what did that mean for her? I don't think we know.
Thank you. Our next question is actually, was there anything in Fanny's upbringing in Bermuda which prepared her for her life as a naval wife?
Well, she did. She grew up in a family of some comfort. Her father had been the Attorney General. He returned to England in 1801, so she was with her sister and brother-in-law. But they're living on a naval base, the southern base of the North American station. Their naval vessels in and out all the time. The naval officers would enjoy the social life in St. George's, Bermuda, where Fanny was brought up. So she knew what she knew naval people from a very early age. I think one thing that intrigued me was that her father had been the Attorney General of the Prize Court in Bermuda. And this means, I'll try to be brief about this, if a British captain, captures an enemy vessel or a vessel carrying contraband, things that would profit the enemy, you captured. If the court adjudicated in your favor, this is how you made your money. This is how Captain Frederick Wentworth in Persuasion makes his money. The capturing captain gets a quarter of the share of the value of the vessel, the value of the cargo. So Fanny knew all about naval prize. Her father was the Attorney General. He was like the judge of the Vice Admiralty Court. So I think she knew a lot about how things worked. She also knew about the dangers of being at sea, because vessels would come in to St. George's that had been caught in horrific weather. They might have lost masts and sails. so she could see for herself what happened if things went badly for you. The newspaper, the Bermuda Gazette, loved naval news, the good things and the bad things. If somebody drowned, it might get reported. I think she knew a lot. So does that prepare her? She wasn't unaware. But I think she felt madly in love, and she was just prepared to take on things that maybe somebody else wouldn't. Hard to say, isn't it?
A brave woman. And did the children stay on board with her, or did they go to relatives from a certain age?
Sorry, what was that again?
Did the children stay on board with them, or did they go to relatives from a certain age?
I think it was a matter of, I think the winter was the worst time on shore in terms of roughness and cold. Cassie, the oldest, was the one that was most vulnerable to seasickness. She was also the one that Fanny was beginning to start to educate. So I think for Cassie, it wasn't only just a matter of comfort, but she thought that with this, particularly the job man's Jane and Cassandra, there'd be a chance to start working on her literacy skills. And I think that was important for Fanny. I think Fanny, perhaps she was failing to do her duty if she just wasn't able to teach her child. Her pocket diary for 1814 has a lovely list of books she was getting for Cassandra, and they're geography books by Mrs. Trimmer. They're books about with some sort of religious content. There's short stories. There's poetry. So it was a variable in terms of what child had what needs and what the weather was like for baby Fan. Baby Fan is born December 1st, 1812. Fanny, from what I can establish, was also nursing her for a while. Baby Fan was less ambulatory. She didn't move around as much as, say, the other two did. I think it was something Fanny couldn't really predict. She had to, just decide what was best at the time, depending what the variables were. But it frustrated her.
Oh, we hope there were some naval wives from lower ranks able to help her with that. But we are getting onto the questions about Jane Austen now.
Oh, yes.
Which are inevitable. So we're coming on to our last couple of questions. But I'll start off with, so do you believe Fanny Austen was a source of inspiration for Jane Austen's novel Persuasion?
Sure. Should we hear what the Jane Austen questions are? I mean, are they all accessible for you to see? And then I could sort of see how they best answered together.
Yeah, so we've been asked, did Jane Austen...
Is she a source of inspiration, if any source of inspiration for Jane? Okay, that's one, yeah.
Yeah, and then did Jane Austen visit Fanny on the Namur?
Oh, all right. Okay, fine. Well, that's good. Thank you. Did she visit Fanny? Now, that's a good question because, if I'm going to go on and say that Fanny shared details of naval life with Jane, I mean, it'd be really cool if we knew that Jane was on the Namur and could see exactly what it was like. Well, I doubt very much that she was, though we know that Cassandra was. Cassandra visited in July 1812. And I think some of you know that Jane and Cassandra were very close as sisters. What Cassandra knew, if Jane, they would share information. So I think it's safe to assume that Jane would hear in great detail from Cassandra what it was like to be on board, what their lifestyle was like, where they were located. And for those of you who know Jane Austen's novel Persuasion, it's in some circles referred to as the naval novel because it has some important characters, both male and female, who are either naval officers or naval wives. Mrs. Croft, who's quite she's maybe central is my judgment call, but she's an important character. She is someone who has very much shared her husband Admiral Croft's life, which has involved a great deal of time at sea. And she is familiar with ships of the higher rates, which the Namur would count as a 74-gun vessel. And so to the extent that Cassandra shared with Jane what it's like to be living on a 74, that might have helped contextualize Mrs. Croft's situation when Jane Austen comes to develop her as a character. For those of you who know Persuasion, you do know that Mrs. Croft was wildly enthusiastic about her quarters, whereas you can see from what I've said, Fanny was much less so as time went on, though their situations are very different. That's probably another issue. But really, I suppose the central question, was Jane an influence on Fanny? And I think to answer that, I wanted to first say that I think there's clear evidence they did have a relationship. I mean, you can't really claim Fanny influenced Jane if they didn't really know each other or know much about each other. The Austen family were great letter writers all their lives within the family. And Fanny becomes engaged to Charles Austen in 1806. They're married in 1807. And so I would expect that it's fair to assume that the correspondence with Jane and Fanny would have begun, from the point of her engagement to Charles. That feeds to Jane information about Fanny's life in the North American station, and Fanny's very articulate letters about how she feels when Charles is sent on mission to Portugal. She is in Halifax. She's very, very worried about whether he'll ever come back to her. There's great anguish in this. These are the sorts of things that Jane might have heard about. Jane would have heard about Charles's pursuit of naval prize, et cetera, et cetera. So there would have been description of aspects of naval life that could have been conveyed, which either was conveyed by Fanny or was about Fanny when Charles conveyed them, which Jane would already have a feed on. Then when they get to England, one of the first things Charles and Fanny and their little girls do is to visit Chatham Cottage and meet Cassandra and Jane and Mrs. Austen. And Cassandra writes an interesting letter to her cousin Philly Walter, just saying that they've been there for the visit. And she describes Fanny as being being amiable, having very gentle manners, and she makes Charles very happy. So this is the sort of the family stamp of approval. So I can't really say that everything Cassandra says is what Jane would have thought as well. But Jane's letters make affectionate references to Fanny. She talks about being at Gomersham Park, there, Jane's brother Edward Knight's estate in Kent. And she describes to Cassandra that Fanny and Charles and the family have arrived. And Fanny, she refers to as part of the Charleses, Fanny's mama, etc. She says Fanny has come down this morning looking just like her own nice self. So I think we know that these two women interrelated. Now, they could have interrelated only at a personal level, and there's no sort of spin-off or no influence on the fiction. But if you think, and again, you need to think about the novel Persuasion, because I think this is where there could be echoes and resonances of Fanny's experiences, her attitudes, her beliefs, her feelings that seem to echo in some of the features of Mrs. Croft, Admiral Croft's wife. For example, one of Austen's biographers, Park Honan, said that he thought that Austen admired Fanny's unfussiness and gallant good sense. And those sort of features seem to cash out, I think, in Mrs. Croft. So that seemed to be one sort of echo. There are also echoes in, I think probably the main one though is the devotion to your husband, and to do that as best as you can. It's a very affectionate portrait of Admiral and Mrs. Croft. They're described as sort of going out, driving together in a gig, or talking to naval friends in Bath, etc. They are very attached and happy couple. Jane Austen describes them as. Fanny and Charles were very attached and happy couple as well. I go through in great detail, and you're spared from this because we don't have as long as it would take. But in chapter 9 of my book, I look very carefully at what I think are the echoes and resonances between Fanny and Mrs. Croft. Now, this doesn't mean that, Fanny was sort of parachuted in and she is Mrs. Croft. It wasn't that. Mrs. Croft is Jane Austen's character. She's her creation. But it intrigued me that there seemed to be these echoes and resonance between what we had learned about Fanny's life and how this seemed to pick out, this seemed to humanize, it seemed to flesh out the character of Mrs. Croft.
Lovely.
Right.
Thank you very much. I do. Oh, Barbara's got a question. Well, I think we'll keep that as our last question.
Okay, good.
True
All
to
right.
form, I want to talk about food a little bit more.
Good. Hi, Barbara.
Am I right in remembering that relatives brought things aboard and Fanny sent notes? Now in COVID, we have groceries delivered. I want to know what her delivery system was, if you recall.
Oh, okay. Thank you, Barbara. I just want to tell people that I'm thanking Barbara. Barbara's one of the godmothers of my novel. Barbara read an early draft and she was most helpful. So Barbara, you're to be appreciated. But you didn't ask for a compliment. I'll answer your question. Yes, Fanny seemed to be a scout out for fresh fish foodstuff she could send into her Palmer family in England, in London. Now, how could she do this? There was a tender which with the Namur, which she would have access to, I would assume, Charles ordering, where she could get into Sheerness or Southend to shop for herself. A word seems to spread to, at one point, Lady Williams tells her there's this fabulous deal on butter that she can get, and talks about the price per pound and how this is wonderful. And Lady Williams is Charles's boss, Sir Thomas Williams' wife. And, so Fanny is sort of going to stock up on these kinds of things. But she also asks for things to be sent out from town when her daughter, little Fan, starts to teeth. She asks for a particular sort of, sounds like a rusk, really. To chomp on, actually. So it's intriguing. I guess you just need to get into a network of seeing what you can access and how you could best get it. But it took planning. And there must have been times that you're frustrated as well, too, when you just have to make do with what you have. Yeah, part of the challenges of domesticity. Anything?
I'd never be that organised. Well, thank you very much, Sheila. I really appreciate you taking the time to speak to us all. We will send out the pre-recorded link for those who would like to watch again. But Sheila did a fantastic job doing it live, as I'm sure you would all agree. So thank you for that, Sheila.
My pleasure.
We'll give you an applause there.
Okay, thank you so much.
For those that are in the UK, you're obviously welcome to come see Fanny Austen in the exhibition itself, but I know a number of you are excitingly off in warmer climates. But if you would like to buy the book, I was just going to add, because it is fantastic, from the UK, it's from uk.bookshop.org, and that's a lovely independent that is selling it. Or I believe there are 741 libraries worldwide that you can actually get the book in as well, which is an amazing feat, Sheila. So again, thank you very much, all of you. And hopefully you had a lovely time after the technical difficulties.
Thanks, Allie.
Thank you all and goodbye.
Bye.